and welcome to Barnes & Noble Union Square. Tonight we are pleased to welcome Doris Kearns Goodwin. Doris Kearns Goodwin won the Pulitzer Prize in History for No Ordinary Time, which was a New York Times bestseller. She is also the author of the bestsellers The Fitzgeralds and Lyndon Johnson and the American Dream. Analyst for the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer and appears frequently on Today, Morning America, and Nightline. Tonight she joins us to discuss her latest book, Wait Till Next Year, a memoir. Ladies and gentlemen, will you please join me in welcoming Doris Kearns Goodwin.
Thank you so much. It has indeed been my great privilege these last few years to have these two loves for history and baseball come together at almost exactly the same time. First and more obviously, my love of history was reflected finally in the publication of my book on Franklin and Eleanor in World War II. Embarrassingly, it took me longer to write the book about World War II than it took the war to be fought. So it was a great relief when it finally came out. And then almost exactly at the same time came this 18-hour documentary on the history of baseball, where because the filmmaker Ken Burns needed an irrational female fan to go along with all the male faces, almost everything I told him appeared on the air, including old boyfriends that I had dropped because they no longer had interest in baseball. My only hope is that they're not watching a documentary on the history of baseball 30 years later. But what happened is where I went to talk about Franklin and Eleanor, people wanted to talk to me as well about baseball, the Dodgers, the Giants, the Yankees, or their own home team. And I realized that it was more than a team that they wanted to share. It was the recollections of family, of neighborhood, of a time that was long gone in their lives. And that's what really prompted me to write my own story of coming of age as a Dodger fan in the deceptively tranquil decade of the 1950s, when my neighbors formed an extended family, when television was young, and when this street really was our common ground. And in the process of writing that memoir, I came to understand more fully than I ever had before that my love of history really had two roots. The first began when I was 6 years old, and my father taught me that mysterious and wondrous art of keeping score with all those miniaturized symbols, so that when he went to work in New York during the day, I could remain on Long Island and score the Brooklyn Dodgers afternoon game. And he'd come home at night and listen for 2 hours as in excruciating detail I recounted for him play by play, inning by inning, absolutely everything that had happened that day. In fact, when you're 6 years old, however, and your father thinks you're doing a wonderful job telling a story, it makes you want to keep doing history the rest of your life, because nothing could matter more than that attention that you're given at 6 years old. He made it even more special for me because he never told me in those early days that all of this was actually described in great detail in the newspapers, in the sports sections the next day. So I thought without me, he would never even know what happened to the Brooklyn Dodgers, which gave history a magic that I must say it still holds to this moment. My father was really an extraordinary man. He had warmth, vitality, and openness to life that in many ways defied the facts of his haunted childhood. I never knew very much about his early life, only that his entire world had collapsed when he was 9 years old. His father was a fireman in Brooklyn. He had a younger brother and a sister. The brother, who was 6 years old, was hit by a trolley car and died 2 months later. His mother died 2 months after that in difficult complications from childbirth, and 2 months after that, his father died. Out of sadness, I was told, a broken heart. It left him an orphan with his little sister Marguerite, who died at the age of 16 in a freak accident in the dentist's chair when something went wrong with anesthesia. And yet, for reasons I will never fully understand, he emerged from this haunted childhood without a trace of self-pity or rancor. On the contrary, he seemed to possess an air of warmth and self-confidence and a remarkable ability to transmit that warmth to others. So that really was the first root of my love for history, that relationship with my father and that special moment every night when I sat and not only recounted the games, but actually would play out some of the games. If it was a home run, I'd scream it out. I finally learned, I think, how to tell a story through him, because at first I would blurt out, the Dodgers won or the Dodgers lost. Then I realized to make it dramatic, I had to tell it time by time, inning by inning. And I think narrative history depends on that chronological spine. But the second root of my love for history, I've often realized now, was traced to my mother's chronic illness. She had had rheumatic fever as a child, which left her with a damaged heart. The doctor said when she was in her 30s, she had the arteries of a 70-year-old, which bound her to our house in Rockville Center, Long Island, as an invalid. She read books, however. In her sense of being caught in the house, she wanted her mind free, and books became her vehicle. She read books in every spare moment, at night when she had trouble breathing, in the mornings after the dishes were done, and every night she would read to me. I loved listening to her voice. It was so much softer and less piercing than mine. She always said she could hear me on our block above all the other kids. I had the loudest voice, and I tended to talk a lot even then. The only joy that surpassed listening to her read a book to me was listening to stories about her girlhood. Her eyes would brighten when she talked about being young before the heart condition had bound her to the house. Her face assumed a relaxed look. And I came to believe somehow irrationally that if only I could keep her youthful memories alive, I could prevent that premature aging process from moving forward. Through her stories, I could imagine her young again, taking the stairs 2 at a time, jumping rope. And I must say, even now, when I interview people for my books, it sometimes seems that I'm sitting with my mother pleading, "Tell me a story." So clearly that understanding of what stories could do to bring back the past, and in my case, even hopefully keep my mother alive, had a powerful root in making me want to tell stories to other people later in my life. For my family, as for so many families in Rockville Center, in the suburbs of New York, owning a house was really in many ways the realization of a dream. The house I grew up in, with modest in size, situated on less than 1/10 of an acre of land, separated from our neighbors by the narrowest of driveways, but my father lovingly tended to our tiny lawn as if it were the grounds of an ancestral estate. Indeed, our houses were so close that the kids on our block really became part of an extended family. We felt free to race into one another's homes without even knocking on the door, much less having doors that were locked. When I started to write the memoir, I felt the need somehow to do research, even though it was only my own life. I knew I was only going to be covering from the age of 6, when my father taught me to keep score, until the age of 15, when the Dodgers were ripped out of Brooklyn to Los Angeles by that evil Walter O'Malley. And 2 months after that, this is one place where I am not an objective historian. I fully admit it. It's a terrible thing. Someday I will write a true record of his need to take them to LA, but not yet. I'm still too emotional. At any rate, I felt the compulsion to somehow do research even on my own miniature life, because I'm so comfortable with research. It's given me the security of all the other books that I've written. So I felt compelled to find every kid who lived on my block, many of whom I hadn't seen in 30 or 40 years. I even found my best friend, Elaine Friedel, who lived next door to me and moved away when we were 12 years old, had moved to Europe, and I hadn't been in touch with her until I started writing the memoir. And she really had almost a photographic memory for our childhood, remembering even that I had learned to read 6 months before her, and I was such a pain in the neck. We would go to Jones Beach. I read every billboard along the way. And she said to me at one point, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Oh, you'll understand someday. Once you start reading, you can never stop." Well, some of the kids on the block remembered the McCarthy era more vividly than others. Some remembered the air raid drills. Some remembered the polio scares, all of which sparked a train of memories in myself that somehow were back there somewhere, but needed to be brought to the surface by the collective memory of everyone on the block. I also went to read the old local newspapers from my town to see if that would spark memories. And indeed, one incredible train of memories came out of reading an old newspaper clipping. In 1950, when I was 7 years old, Roy Campanella, the Dodger catcher, came to our town of Rockville Center. And I remembered reading that article when I was a kid because I was so excited it would be the first Dodger player I would meet outside of Ebbets Field. The only problem as I read the article further was that I realized he was speaking at the Episcopal Church, and I was brought up as a Catholic, and somehow we were told that you could never set foot in any other church but a Catholic church, or somehow you would be doomed to a terrible end. And I was in the middle of my first Holy Communion and very caught up in all of this at that time. So I said to my father, "What am I going to do? I have to see Roy Campanella, but I can't go into this church." And he said to me, "I really think it's all right. He's speaking in the parish hall. He's talking about juvenile delinquency and sportsmanship. It has nothing to do with religion. You can go in the church." So I went with my dad that night, but as I stepped over the threshold, my knees trembled. I thought I would faint. But finally, he got me to a seat. It was a wonderful night. Campanella gave a fabulous talk. He came over and he shook my hands afterwards. I was thrilled until that night I got into bed, and then all the warnings of the nuns tumbled through my head. And I was certain that I had traded the life of my everlasting soul for this one night with Roy Campanella. So the very next night I couldn't sleep either, and there was a big commotion downstairs, and I went downstairs to find out what had happened, and it turned out there had been a very big train wreck in Rockville Center. 2 trains had collided before the tracks had been elevated, and my sisters had just come home from seeing the wreck, and I suddenly realized that in this terrible calamity there was an opportunity for my salvation, because we had been taught that if you could find a dying person and baptize them before they died, you would get a lot of sins removed from your own soul. So somehow, in a very wacky thing to do, I slipped undetected out of my house. I had practiced this baptism on my doll many times anyways. So I figured I'd just go there, and clearly I could find somebody. Fortunately, so that it wasn't as ghoulish as it might have been, when I got to the train station, there were dozens of priests around already ministering to the victim, so I knew that I wasn't needed or wanted. So at least I didn't go the next step of picking up the blankets and asking somebody if they wanted to be baptized by me. Which meant, however, that I still had this terrible sin on my soul when I went to my first confession. So I decided strategically that I would tell the priest right away and get it over with as quickly as I could. Well, the priest was great. When I told him what I'd done, he asked me, "Did you participate in a service?" And I said, "No, I didn't." He said, "There's no problem." Huge relief on my soul, except I knew I had another set of unordinary sins that I had to confess. So I figured I would try to mush them in between the other sins that are more normal for a 7-year-old. Like talking in church 10 times, disobeying my mother, wishing harm to others quite a few times, talking back to my teacher. Well, unfortunately, he called and said, "Well, and to whom did you wish harm?" Just what I didn't want him to do. And I had to admit that there was a few people I wished harm to. I wished harm to Allie Reynolds. And he said, "The Yankee pitcher? And how did you wish to harm him?" "Well, I wanted him to break his arm." "And how often did you make this wish?" "Every night," I admitted, "before going to bed in my prayers." "And were there others?" "Oh, yes," I admitted. "I wish that Robin Roberts of the Phillies would fall down the steps of his stoop and break his arm, and that Richie Ashburn would sprain his ankle. Is there anything else?" "Oh, yes, I wish that Enos Slaughter of the Cards would break his ankle, Phil Rizzuto of the Yankees would fracture a rib, and Alvin Dark would hurt his knee. But I hasten to add, I wish that all these injuries would go away immediately once the baseball season ended." And then, encouraged by his silence, I proceeded to describe sneaking out of the house that night and the more macabre thoughts that had arisen since the train wreck, when my sinful thoughts had expanded to encompass a desire that the train carrying the New York Yankees to Boston would fail to stop at a signal. My scenario, of course, left no permanent injuries, but put the entire team out of action for the year so the Dodgers could finally win the World Series. "But how would you feel knowing that the victory wasn't really deserved?" the priest asked. "Knowing that if your rivals had been healthy, your team might not have won. I promise you it wouldn't feel anywhere near as good as if you won in the proper way. Now let me tell you a secret. I love the Dodgers just as much as you do, but I believe they will win the World Series someday, fairly and squarely. You don't need to wish harm on others to make it happen. Do you understand what I'm saying?" "Yes, Father." "Are there any other sins?" "No, Father." "So for your penance, say 2 Hail Marys, 3 Our Fathers, get out of here and say a special prayer for the Dodgers." So, I must admit, my first confession to a baseball-loving priest left me closer to my church than ever before. But of all the seasons of my youth, the baseball season of 1951, ending with Bobby Thompson's, the New York Giants home run in the 9th inning of the playoff game, the final game against the Dodgers, would be seared into my memory as it was seared into the memory of every Dodger fan. In fact, one of the horrible things now about talking about the book and being on radio shows is they insist on playing that moment for me, so I have to live it all over again. It held a special meaning for me that season because it was the first season I could watch the Dodgers in full on our new television. Television in the early days, as so many of you may remember, strangely came clothed as the bearer of communal bonds rather than fragmenting forces, for we would all gather together in one another's house as each person got a larger and larger set, from 7-inch to 9-inch to 11-inch to 13-inch, watching Milton Berle one night, Howdy Doody one afternoon. And the block on our neighborhood was equally divided between Dodger, Giant, and Yankee fans. Each one had brought their loyalties as they moved from the city, almost as immigrants bring their loyalties to the country when they come to America. So that season held a special meaning because television was there. There was also a special meaning because there were a group of fans, rabid Giant fans, who occupied the butcher shop around the corner from our house. One of the things about growing up in the suburbs in the 50s, where there were a series of corner stores, a drugstore, a butcher shop, a soda shop, a delicatessen, we knew the families who owned those stores as if they were part of our extended block. So all the guys in the butcher shop used to call me Rag Mop because my hair was always messy, and every time I'd go in, they'd tease me about my Dodgers. And the Giants and the Dodgers that season, everybody knew were going to be the 1 and 2 contenders. So they made a decision early on to put a set of standings on the window, and they said I could fill in the Dodgers day by day, who had won the game, how many runs, how many hits. They'd fill in the Giants. Well, it made me feel so special. I'm now 8 years old to be recording not only for my father, but the entire block, the entire town, in fact, I could think. Well, the Dodgers started the season great. They won a whole series of games in a row. Every Dodger was hitting the heart of my team, Campanella, Robinson, Snyder, Ferrillo, all hitting over 300, except for poor Gil Hodges, the first baseman, who was in a terrible batting slump. So he too was coming to our town, and I figured I had to do something to get him out of his batting slump. And I came up with the perfect solution. Prior to his coming, I had been in a catechism contest in which I had been pitted against a parochial school student. I went to public school, and like a spelling bee, we had all these questions, and it finally came down to the final questions. Only the 2 of us were left standing, and the last question was to name the 7 deadly sins. So she yelled out lust, I yelled out covetousness. We got up to pride, to envy. Finally, we got to the 7th deadly sin, and she didn't know what it was. I could see on her face that she was completely at a blank. She softly said deceit, and I knew she was wrong, and I yelled out gluttony, and I won the St. Christopher's Medal blessed by the Pope. So I figured if the St. Christopher's Medal, blessed by the Pope, could carry you safely on a travel journey, which is what it was meant for, it could carry Gil Hodges safely around the bases. So I went to this thing at the sport where he was signing baseballs, and I told him the entire story, unfortunately, because I talked too much even then, as I say, so he had to hear about lust and gluttony and everything. And then finally I said, and I'd like you to have this St. Christopher's Medal. But instead of laughing, he told me that he had actually once had a Christopher's Medal blessed by the Pope, but that he had given it to his father, who was a coal miner and needed it more than he did because he had lost an eye and several limbs in the coal mines, and now he was so proud to have it on one of his own. Well, the next day the Dodgers went on the road. He went into a great tear, hit home run after home run. The reporters claimed it was because he had left home where he had a newborn baby that was keeping him up at night, but I, of course, knew better. Well, that season all came down to that final game, 3-game playoff series. The last game would determine it all. I came home for lunch that day. My mother said I could stay home the rest of the day. I discovered that more than half our class failed to return that day. The Dodgers were ahead 4-1 in the 9th inning. The Giants got 1 man on base. They got a couple men. It was 4-2. And my sister predicted when Bobby Thompson came up to bat, and she was quite beautiful, and I was always envious of her anyway, that he was going to hit a home run. He did indeed hit that home run. We had to listen to that sound that I've heard a million times later. The Giants win the pennant! The Giants win the pennant! Said 4 times. And what happened is I was so humiliated and saddened I could not return to the butcher shop to fill in that final day's standings. I would walk on the opposite side of the street rather than going into the butcher shop until finally, 2 weeks later, the first bouquet of flowers anyone ever sent me, red roses, came to my door with a tag on it saying, "Dear Rag Mop, please come back. We miss you, your friends at the butcher shop." I, of course, swallowed my humiliation and ran to the store and was able to fill in that final terrible day. But if the era of the 1950s was more innocent in many ways, if we were free to walk or ride our bikes anywhere without a moment's notice, there were nonetheless sweeping fears of polio, where the lack of understanding about its spread led our parents to 1,000 admonitions. Avoid swimming in cold water, avoid sitting in wet clothes, don't share pencils or you'll end up in an iron lung. And then, of course, there was this terrible fear of the nuclear war engendered by the Cold War. Our generation was the first to live with the knowledge that at any instant, the entire world we knew could be taken away. We had these A-bomb drills in school where I could never imagine that this flimsy desk with its worn inkwell and years of name scratchings was going to protect me from this huge atomic bomb, but I did what I was told. We also were told to practice instant fallings at night before we went into bed so that we could get under our bed. I somehow, remembering back to all the time I spent practicing these fallings, saying prayers for the Dodgers, saying prayers for the poor souls in purgatory, and saying prayers for myself, it's a wonder that I ever got to sleep in these early days. And so the years of my childhood passed. with a hauntingly similar pattern of behavior of luck for my beloved Dodgers. Year after year, we'd be touted as the best team, we would win the pennant, and year after year, we would lose to the vaunted Yankees. No team had ever come so close so many times without winning, which led, of course, to the famous slogan, "Wait till next year." But finally, in 1955, our dreams came true. It came down to the 7th game of the World Series, the 9th inning, the Dodgers ahead of the Yanks by a score of 2-0. Only 3 more outs, I prayed. I think I've said that so many times in my life. But this time, Padres shut the Yankees down. And when Vin Scully announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, the Brooklyn Dodgers are champions of the world," my mother and I jumped up with tears streaming down our cheeks. Minutes later, my father called from Brooklyn, where he was examining. He was a state bank examiner, the William Savings Bank, and told us there'd be a great celebration that night in Brooklyn. We had to come into the city. We later learned that his call was one of tens of thousands made between 3:44 p.m. and 4:01 as parents and children, friends and lovers exchanged screams and shouts. It was the largest volume of calls since VJ Day, a decade before. Well, Brooklyn that night was alive with 1,000 people dancing in the streets. No one wanted the night to end. Before coming home, we stood on the East River looking over at Manhattan. For so many years, Brooklyn had felt a sense of inferiority to Manhattan, but that night, Brooklyn, not Manhattan, was the center of the world. Well, during the next few years, as the world of my childhood slipped away, I would remember that magical evening when my mother stood at the edge of the river, the soft light smoothing the lines on her face. I would recall the laughter of the crowd, for after that night, one element after another of my little world began to crumble. First, there had been a familiar group of people who lived on our block year after year, but now the increasing affluence allowed several families to move to larger homes in larger neighborhoods, which meant that that stability was taken away. At the same time, the corner stores began to feel the impact of the encroaching supermarkets. Eventually, the chain of drugstores has taken away from those corner stores. Only one store is now left. Baseball was also changing. Teams began moving around in search of increased revenues. And as I said, Walter O'Malley took our beloved Dodgers away in 1957 to Los Angeles. There's a California fan here. After the Dodgers left that same fall, my mother's health took a decided turn for the worse. She suffered a stroke. She seemed to come back, but the toll on her body, 3 or 4 heart attacks through my childhood, was too much. In February of 1958, she suffered a massive heart attack and died in her sleep. She was 51 years old, and I had just turned 15. After my mother died, our house seemed to shrink around us, one room after another disappearing as my father found himself unable to endure the porch where he and my mother had shared cocktails every evening, unwilling to eat in the breakfast nook where their day had begun, incapable of sleeping in the bedroom where she had died. His depression left him no choice but to sell our house as quickly as possible. I was sad, even resentful, at the prospect of leaving the only house I had ever known. Reluctantly, I began to sort through my belongings. I sat in the middle of our attic floor, boxes of old report cards, baseball cards, and programs piled around me. Then behind a stack of newspapers stood an old wooden trunk I had never seen before. I lifted the lid and uncovered a thick manila folder marked Family Documents. I pulled out a sheaf of birth and death certificates arranged in chronological order. And at first I was thrilled with my discovery, for here, written in hand at the time of each birth and each passing, was the documentary history of my family. I learned that my father's parents had come from Ireland when they were teenagers, that his 6-year-old brother John had been hospitalized for nearly a month after that trolley accident before he died. My grandmother Ellen, my father's mother, I learned had died at 5 a.m., the very hour that I had been born. And then I came upon a document titled Death Certificate Number 799, verifying my father's death at the age of 40. Uncomprehending, I read the stunned, unanticipated words, cause of death, pistol shot to the head. And then in the coroner's precise script, Thomas Kearns, 633 Myrtle Avenue, Brooklyn, suicide. My romantic imaging of a grandfather so sunk in grief that his heart had simply broken was shattered. My poor brave father, I thought, if I grieved for the loss of my mother, what must it mean to him whose entire life had been drowned in death? My self-pity and trivial resentments at moving drained away. Then, absorbed in my thoughts, I never heard the footsteps. I started at the sound of my father's voice. I see you found the family papers, he said. His voice sounded small and weary. Why did you never say anything about your father, I asked. I thought he died of sadness. My father didn't reply right away. He put his hand on my head and sat down beside me. I'm sorry, he said finally. Sometimes you have to forget what you've lost and deal with what you've got. You see, in a way, you were right all along. He did die of sadness. I would have told you about all this when you were older, when I thought it wouldn't hurt you or make you feel ashamed of our family." He sighed and he surveyed my boxes. "My, you've really got a collection here. I wish I could keep it all. I know we won't have room for it," I said, "but I hate to throw anything away." "I know this move won't be easy on you," he said, "but I don't see any other way. I loved your mother so much I can still see her in every room." "But that's exactly why I wanted to stay," I said. My father squeezed my shoulders. "Do you still have every year?" he asked, looking at the pile of Dodger scorebooks. "Yes," I said, "since 1949, when you gave me the first one and taught me how to keep score." "They were so close so many times," he said, shaking his head. "Remember, we said if they just kept fighting, they would make it in the end. And they did. We'll just have to do the same." And then, for the first time in months, I saw him smile. He pointed toward an old calendar printed after Bobby Thompson had destroyed the Dodgers' hopes in 1951. "Look at that," he said. And there it was in large black type, "Wait till next year." The simple slogan woven of pain, bravado, and prayer that had served Dodger fans as a recurring anthem and would now serve our own family as a promise of the healing that time would indeed bring. And in the years that followed, my father's strength did reassert itself. He married a wonderful and warm woman, took pleasure in life once more, and became a passionate Mets fan. And then in 1965, while studying for my doctorate at Harvard, my boyfriend took me to Fenway Park to see the Red Sox play. And there it was again, the darkened ramp disclosing an expanse of amazing green, the fervent crowd, the cozy ballpark. It was love at first sight. Nor could I have found a team more reminiscent of the Brooklyn Dodgers than the Boston Red Sox. Exciters of hope year after year, destroyers of dreams. And then after my father died, and I got married and had 3 sons, somehow my love for baseball took on an even more intense form. Indeed, sometimes when I sit at Fenway Park with my boys, I imagine myself back at Ebbets Field, a young girl once more in the presence of my father, watching the players of my youth on the grassy fields below, Jackie Robinson, Duke Snider, Gil Hodges, Roy Campanella. There is magic in these moments. For when I open my eyes and see my sons in the place where my father once sat, I feel an invisible bond among our 3 generations, an anchor of loyalty and love linking my sons to the grandfather whose face they never got a chance to see, but whose person they have come to know through this most timeless of sports. Thank you so very much. Thank you very much. It's great to be talking about this here in New York. What better place? Please feel free to come forward and ask me questions about any or all of this. Yes, just come right up to the mic, I think.
Thank you very much. Am I close enough? Thank you. I wonder very much, I really appreciated your talk. Can you comment on your title, Wait Till Next Year, and your attitude as a fan and how it relates? Thank you. I'm going to repeat the beginning of that.
Go ahead.
Can you comment on the title, Wait Till Next Year, and how it relates to you as a fan, and how that suggests looking forward into the future, and how as a historian you learned to look toward the past? And I think there's a relationship between those 2 things. Perhaps you can comment on that.
Oh, what a wonderful question. I mean, I think your question is right, that the title reflected, Wait Till Next Year, a collective hope that the future would bring some sort of comfort and solace in a certain sense. If your team had not managed to meet your dreams that fall, there was always spring, there was always next year. It had obviously a seasonal meaning to it as well, that after winter came spring, which so many people have commented on, that baseball emerges once more after the winter when spring does come. And it was interesting to see even last week when the New York Yankees lost, there was a wait till next year in the newspapers here in New York, wait for them until next year. But I think you're right. I think it meant for me as a child perhaps looking to the future. But now as an historian, what I seem to feel is that I can take and hopefully give my readers a great sense of comfort and solace by looking to the past and making it feel like it's not really gone forever. I think what made this memoir mean so much to me was to bring those memories of my childhood and my parents just closer to my heart. So I feel now, instead of having moved forward in a line, I've circled back to my childhood, and somehow it's deeper inside of me and closer to my heart. I feel like I'm carrying them with me now. And my hope is that in all the books that I've tried to write, ranging from that first one on Lyndon Johnson, where because I knew him so well at the age of 24, and when he died it was like this giant figure who was gone, I wanted so much to keep him alive for the readers through the book, where he had shared so much of his memories with me. The only problem being, of course, that half of his stories weren't true, but they were fabulously interesting. So he probably made me want to create him again. In fact, I keep worrying that he's out there somewhere saying, how come that book on the Roosevelts was twice as long as the book he wrote about me? But without question, for example, on this most recent book on the Roosevelts, to be able to go back and recreate that era of the 1940s when our country was united by a common goal against a common enemy made me feel in this more fragmented American time as if I could carry that remembrance with me to another time in the future when we would have that sense of patriotism, that sense of a common bond once more. So I think you're right. I think it gave me as a child a sense of looking forward, but now my look at history in the past also gives me some sort of lessons and comfort and solace that I hope the readers can take, and also myself as I look forward into the future. What else is on your minds? Yes.
I'd like to ask you to comment on the American loss of community and public space and the implications of that.
The question, if you couldn't hear it, was to comment on the American loss of community and public space. And I think one of the things that struck me so in writing this book was the realization of how physical space does, in many ways, shape the sense of community. Our block was a block that wasn't much traveled, so that we felt we could occupy the streets. And because we were on the street all day, from the beginning of the morning when we awakened till we went to bed at night, we were together. There was a sense of community that extended then to our parents. We were on the streets when our fathers came home from work at the end of the day. Those stores were part of our neighborhood. Our world gradually expanded little by little. Before television was a fragmenting force, we would read our books outside under a tree in the summertime. I think what's happened in our modern life is that so many of the technological improvements that have come into our lives, ranging from the telephone replacing letter writing, ranging from the fax now and the computer letting us be at home alone if we need to and want to, does mean that that public space is less utilized. I think even in our politics, public space has been diminished. It used to be when Roosevelt gave his fireside chats, the entire nation listened on the radio, and you felt connected to your fellow Americans as well as his voice. You used to feel that way about the State of the Union message. You used to feel that way about the convention acceptance speeches. Now there's so many choices that people don't even come together for those few moments of ceremony in our national life. So I think that problem of public space where people can share the daily events of their lives has to be expanded, and I think that's something that people are working on. I think it will come back, and it does always crop up like a flower in various places because it's such a human need that it answers. Yes.
You're a baseball fan, and you're a professor of government. Things like, baseball antitrust exemption, and where the world of government and politics crosses paths with baseball. Did you take an interest in that, or do you keep those separate?
No, I think that what your question suggests is that there are problems that current-day baseball has to address. It used to be, the reason the antitrust provision was allotted to baseball was that baseball was special. It was somehow the national pastime. It didn't have to accord with the ordinary rules. But I think what's happened is we've seen in many ways a diminution of that passion of baseball because of the salaries that the players are making, because free agentry came in, allowing players to move from one team to another. The heart of the Dodgers stayed together my whole childhood, so that if you gave loyalty to a team, they would give it back to you in return. You feel a little irrational anyway, waking up in the morning feeling good if your team has won and bad if they've lost. I said to myself, what is the matter with me? But nonetheless, you feel a little less silly when they can give you something back in return. But I think now that all of that has been splintered, it may be well time that the leaders of baseball, I would wish they would do it first. If we had a commissioner who had some leadership capacity, could figure out about what kind of salary cap might have been necessary, whether we can designate franchise players to keep them in the home cities the way football is able to do. They've got to figure out how to market baseball players nationally in a way that football and basketball does. They're so at each other's throats that they're not willing to care about the good of the sport. I still think, obviously, it's one of the best sports there is, and there's no reason why people won't still love it in the future, but lacking leadership in the last decade has hurt it very much, and I think there's a lot of creative thinking that has to go into it. Yes.
Thank you. I am a cousin of Cal Abrams, who recently died.
Oh my God.
And I brought with me a piece of memorabilia that says, "Mantle Schmantle, we have Abrams."
Oh, that's wonderful.
And that was from May 25th, 1951 in the New York Post.
Oh, that's wonderful.
I just wonder, not having read your book yet, which we purchased 2 of them tonight, if you wrote about Richie Ashburn having thrown Calvin out at home base, because we visited Calvin shortly before he died, and he said, "I probably would have been forgotten very quickly, but for the fact that I was thrown out of home base," he said, "I guess I'll be remembered forever."
Oh, that's wonderful. No, I absolutely have included that story. I mean, it's one of those stories as a Dodger fan that you just kept hearing over and over again, a lost opportunity at the last moment. In 1941, the catcher Mickey Owens drops the 3rd strike and the Dodgers lose. In 1950, Cal Abrams was waved around from second base to home on a single that was hit to Richie Ashburn in center field, who had a notoriously weak arm, so they thought he could make it home. However, he was thrown out at home plate, and that ended the Dodgers' hopes for the pennant that year. So it's absolutely true that Cal Abrams will be in that pantheon of sort of romantic lost opportunities for Dodger fans. But what happened to me as a kid, I would hear these stories, and I would start dreaming about it turning around. This was the fantasy in me. I would imagine that Cal Abrams had actually made it home and was a hero and was being mobbed. I imagined that Mickey Owens, in one of my dreams, had caught that 3rd strike, and the Dodgers had went on to win the World Series. So in my nighttime dreams, I could turn around what had happened in the day, but then I'd wake up in the morning and there still was Cal Abrams being tagged out at home. Yes.
I have 2 questions. First of all, would you accept the job as baseball commissioner?
Oh, would that were possible.
If that were possible. Well, the president of Yale was.
That is true.
Some writer once said that baseball is what we were, football is what we are, and basketball is what we're going to be as a culture. Could you comment on that?
That's a really interesting thought. I'm not sure I'd heard that. I mean, I think what that may refer to is that baseball was the national pastime at a time when there was a slower pace to life, and at a time when radio could transmit the game as well as any other medium. And that football fits our current life right now because television is so perfectly suited to capture a football game, sometimes even better than being at the game itself. We are now season ticket holders of the Patriots, so I'm also a football fan. But the difference for me is that somehow, since baseball was part of my childhood, there's an emotional connection to it. I feel happy when the Patriots win, but it doesn't somehow strike all these crazy chords that baseball once did. And then I suppose the theory is that basketball is even faster and more, I'm not sure I know why it would be the game of the future, but I don't want to believe that that's so. I mean, I still think there's room in our modern fast-paced life for a game like baseball, which does admittedly move at a slower pace. What's so wonderful is you can think in the middle of the innings. You can remember, like, for example, the other day when there was this passed ball and that was in the playoffs, the ball was dropped, I suddenly am thinking of Mickey Owens. It allows you, because it doesn't move at such a furious pace as basketball and football do, to remember. And if you remember, you're recollecting your own past, as I said earlier, as well as the present and the future. So I think it's really always going to have a niche. It's a different kind of feeling you get from baseball than you get from football or basketball. But I think they satisfy different human needs in all of us. And I'd hate to think that our world has reached a point now where the pace is so fast that we cannot enjoy the leisurely pace of a baseball game. Anyways, if you really know what's happening, something's happening every minute. The guy is leading off first or third, and the pitcher is winding up, the catcher is making all sorts of movements. There's something happening for the observant eye. Yes.
Are you the slightest bit embarrassed about the way Don Imus and Chuck McCord fawn over you?
I'll tell you, it's been a wonderfully strange relationship. I was never on Imus when my Roosevelt book came out, and yet he had read the book and he talked about it on the air quite a lot. So it made me like him, I must say, before I had even met him. So the first time I was on the show was this January talking about the inauguration of Clinton, and somehow he does get you to admit embarrassing things on the air, which is probably why he likes it. I somehow described the death of Nelson Rockefeller to 15 million viewers and described his, I won't describe it here tonight on C-SPAN, once was bad enough, but nonetheless I had gotten some inside information about the relationship that he was having with this young woman when he died, and I found myself somehow intrigued by Imus into telling it. So after that he decided she's not just a Harvard historian, she might be okay. But I must say, he's been wonderful to me. I like him enormously. He's fun to be with. He even looked gentle this morning when I was on there. He was wearing a pink shirt, and I was thinking that his softness in his face was partly that we've established a nice, easy relationship. But I know better than to relax. There's always that moment when you're on there, you say nothing interesting, and after you leave, they say, she's the worst guest we've ever had. It hasn't happened yet, but it may someday, so I will keep on guard. Yes.
The title of your book begs the question, what does come next? Not to push you along, but what is your next project or focus?
Oh, I'd be glad to tell you that. I actually know for one of the first times. Usually it takes a while to move from one book to the other because you feel so much loyalty to the subject you've just left behind that it's hard to leave it. You feel almost a betrayal by doing so. So it took me a while to figure out after the Kennedys that I would end up doing the Roosevelts. But I've now decided that I'm going to do, and have been working on it for the last couple years, Abraham Lincoln's presidency from 1861 to 1865 to try and recreate for the reader what it was like to live in Lincoln's White House, just as I tried to do with Roosevelt. And the exciting thing is I think I've figured out that the way, hopefully, to do that is to understand the relationships that Lincoln had. His 3 cabinet officers, or 4, who came in the start, Stanton and Sumner, not Sumner, he's in the Congress, but Stanton and Seward, feeling a sense of denigration of Lincoln, eventually came to a great regard for him, trying to trace that change in the relationship as a way of getting Lincoln, dealing, of course, with his wife, Mary, and their kids, and with these 2 wonderful assistants who lived in the White House, John Hay and John Nicolay. All their diaries have always been used, but they're fabulous characters, so I want to make them characters as if it were a novel. And I'm having a wonderful time. The only difficulty has been that I had to take my Roosevelt books and put them in another room because my study didn't have room for all the Lincoln books that I have now gathered. And I did feel this sense of great sadness and sort of a loss of Roosevelt. But hopefully Lincoln is now filling his place. And hopefully maybe I'll be back here in a few years having finished Lincoln. That would be a great treat. Yes.
Hi. I just wanted to let you know that, regarding Walter O'Malley, your loss was my gain because I grew up listening to the Dodgers in Los Angeles and listening to...
I understand.
I was a kid listening to Vince Scully.
It's not your fault.
But Vince Scully is the best.
Oh, and he still is, which is
the
so
best,
wonderful.
of course. And my mom took me to games, and so I can't wait to read your book. I'm very excited.
Thank you very much.
But my question is, given the state of baseball right now, and alluding to what the gentleman said earlier, if you were commissioner, what would you do to improve the game, and how do you feel about realignment and other things?
Well, I think the first thing I would do is I do think there has to be some sort of salary cap. It seems to me so unfair when you looked at all the teams that made it into the playoffs this year. You could almost chart those teams as the highest payroll teams. And for so many cities who cannot afford that kind of payroll, if year after year, except by some fluke, maybe one of them will get into the playoffs, by and large, the teams who have the most money to spend are going to put their teams into the playoffs in the World Series. As a national sport, that can't exist that way. The only way that that's going to be corrected is if there is a salary cap and all the teams have to abide by that and make the choices that people in football do. If you're going to pay a huge amount to one player, you're going to have to pay a lesser amount to other people. You're going to have to juggle it, just as I think the National League is so much better for not having that designated hitter to have to juggle the lineup in order to make the pitcher come in or out. So I think the owners should have to be able to make those choices and have a salary cap that puts them on some sort of equal or plane. Obviously, revenue sharing has to be a lot more than it is now if we're going to create that. And I think somewhere along the line there's got to be a way. If a player is in a team and wants to stay in that town but has become a superstar and is about to be offered more money somewhere else, I wish there were a way that every team somehow would have to contribute money to a central fund from which then the local team could draw to keep part of that salary. It would benefit everybody in the long run. Or maybe you could designate, as they do in football, a franchise player that somebody would have to give you something in return, really in return, if you let them go. But we've got to restore that sense of identity to fans, that their team has some stability, that the players who they grow to love will have some sense of continuity, and that means maybe, hopefully, they're getting more involved in their communities while they're there. There's such a sense of entitlement on the part of the players now that our players of my youth, or maybe it's just my romantic imagining, seem to feel much more a sense of gratitude for what they had gotten. Even during that 1955 World Series, when we stood 10,000 strong outside the Hotel Bossert where the Dodgers celebration was going on, the players kept coming out over and over again to thank us and say that without our love and support they could not have won the World Series. I just don't see that happening in the same way, except for a few fans today. So somehow that's the spirit that if one were a leader, one would have to figure out. It's not impossible. If Roosevelt was able to move our country from an isolationist country that had absolutely no weapons and tanks and planes to speak of in 1940, so that 2 years later we were outproducing the Nazis and all of the Axis powers and all of the Allied powers combined, somehow leadership could get baseball back in good order. Yes. Yes. Okay, 2 more questions.
You mentioned 1949 was kind of the coming of age in baseball. 47 was so critical because of Jackie Robinson.
Oh, absolutely.
Did that still resonate in Lily White, Rockville Center? Was that a big topic in 1949?
Well, no.
Did it have real meaning?
Oh, absolutely it did. And also there was actually a black community in Rockville Center. We had been a town that had long been integrated. But even in the white part of Rockville Center, Jackie Robinson was an absolute hero. I'm not sure when I was a child that I understood the importance of his role to civil rights. But I certainly understood the importance of his role to the Dodgers, that the moment he got onto first base, he somehow stole his way to second, and then he somehow got the pitcher so distracted that he was on third, and the next thing you knew, he was home. He made you feel if he got on base, he would somehow get home, and he became clearly my favorite player. In fact, there's 2 stories relating to him, and only later did I realize as an adult what an extraordinary figure he was in civil rights as well as in baseball. But when each time I would go to the Ebbets Field, I wanted so to get his autograph. The problem was the line was so long for Jackie Robinson that I kept getting frustrated, and I'd move over to other lines that were shorter, like this rookie Clem Labine, who was available because no one was on his line. So I got his card, and he signed it, and then I went back to Jackie Robinson's line. It was still moving too slowly, so I went back to Labine's line again. And he said to me, "Weren't you just here?" And I had to think quickly on my feet, and I said, "Oh, yes, but you see, this way, if I have 2 cards, I can keep one, and then I'll trade another one when I go home tonight, even up for Jackie Robinson." He said, "Do you really mean you could trade me even up for..." I was in completely over my head. And I said, "Absolutely, I will." Well, then later that year, when Clem Labine came up on the team and did really well at the beginning, so he was doing well and he was a tradable commodity, I did indeed trade him, but I had to throw in 3 other cards. I didn't keep my promise. So the next day, Clem Labine gave up a Grand Slam home run, and I was sure it was my fault. But at any rate, finally, when I was 12 years old, I went to Pee Wee Reese night. It was his 37th birthday, and there was a big celebration at Ebbets Field, and I got Jackie Robinson's autograph. What I did was to bring my autograph book with me. At that time, girls in school would have these crazy autograph books you'd sign with one another. You know, "I'll love you till Niagara Falls," or "Until Rubber Tires." And I figured if I got him to sign his name on the middle of this page, it would look like he was one of my intimate friends. And I figured he would never look. He would just sign. But he looked down at the autograph book and he saw all these autographs, and my face reddened. And then he thought for a moment, and catching the whole spirit of it, he wrote, "Keep your smile a long while, Jackie Robinson." I thought I was going to faint. But anyway, just one final comment on Jackie Robinson. A wonderful thing happened just a week ago last Sunday. I was asked to present the Eleanor Roosevelt Award to Rachel Robinson, his widow, which meant that the heroine of my adulthood, Eleanor Roosevelt, I was able, through her good name, to meet Rachel Robinson and give her the Eleanor Roosevelt Award. And I must say, when you meet the heroes of your childhood, somehow you revert back to childhood. I can meet presidents and have no embarrassment talking to them, but when I first saw her, that classic face, and knowing what she'd been through and knowing what she and Jackie had partnered, it took me a while to get my normally very outward voice back again. It was great. Last question.
Ms. Goodwin, speaking about next year, how do you feel about chances of the Boston Red Sox in their division? And will General Manager Dan Duquette give away, will he give away Mo Vaughn, the first baseman?
It would
and
be,
if he does, can we have him on the Yankees?
I'll tell you, Mo Vaughn has been one of the best players that Boston has had, not only because of his work on the field, but he's been a fabulous community source for everybody in the town. But in terms of the chances of the Red Sox in the future, all I can keep remembering is that in 1986, when the Red Sox almost, as all of you probably remember, won the World Series, but for that ball going through Bill Buckner's legs, my two youngest kids were then like 7 and 8 years old, and I was crying. They didn't understand. They came to me and they said, "Mom, what's the matter with you?" And I said, "Oh," and all I could think of was, I can't tell them the truth. They haven't won since 1918. They say to me, "Mom, don't worry, they'll win next year." And I thought, I know this horrible thing that they don't yet know, that this may have been the only time in our lifetime that the Red Sox are going to win the World Series. So I just sort of tried to screw up my courage, and I said to them with a smile, "You're right, they'll win next year." Well, now all I can hope is that before I'm in a nursing home at the end of my life watching 162 games year after year, that they will win before I die. They will, I think. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen,